because I had already gone through so much with my parents and moving to Israel and moving to Chicago. I was not intimidated.
This week's interview is part of a series I've been running on former students of the 1992 Nobel Prize winner Gary Becker that I call Becker's Students. So with the professor of economics at San Diego State University, Dr. Shoshana Grossbard. I've been a longtime admirer of Shoshana because of her work on the family and the economics of the household. She's written about a range of topics in that space, as well as has edited a journal called Review of Economics of the Household for many years. We talked before, but never quite like this. It's an interview I'm going to remember for a very long time. Dr. Grossbard begins the interview sharing about her family. She grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust with several immediate family members who were killed in Auschwitz death camps, as well as her father, who very nearly was. She shares her time in Israel as a young person and her first encounter with Economist at Hebrew University. The interview naturally evolved to discuss her time at Chicago, where she met and took classes from Gary Becker, as well as Milton Friedman and many others. This is probably the most candid interview I've done, though. Shoshana shares a great deal about her disappointments in life and around being an economist. And I will just say that and let you hear the rest from her. It was a real honor that she would open up with me the way she did. I felt very fortunate to be present for all of it. I'm teaching a course on the history of economic thought, and after we finished, I realized that stories like Shoshana's are never included in the history of economic thought. They're the kinds of stories that never get told, and they don't even appear in the footnotes. I think Shoshana's candid honesty about how she responded to the disappointments of her career are really thought-provoking, and I hope that you will listen with an open mind and an open heart. I'm Scott Cunningham, and this is the Mixtape with Scott.
Okay, well, it is my pleasure this week to have on the podcast with me someone that I've known and admired for a long, long time, Dr. Shoshana Grossbard. But I don't know if I've pronounced your name right, Shoshana. Am I saying it correctly? Yeah. Okay. Well, I've said your name, but could you, for the sake of the listener, tell us a little bit about yourself, your name, your any kind of title that you would sort of be known to, but that you would sort of, associate yourself with, anything, institutions or anything that you work for?
Yeah, well, I'm Shoshana Grossbard, and I've been associated with San Diego State University for more than 40 years. And I immigrated to the United States 50 years ago. It's just been my 50th anniversary.
Oh, wow. Okay, great. Well, and you were in the economics department. You've been in the economics department at San Diego State.
I'm still at the economics department.
Still at the economics department.
And my official title is, researcher. I don't know. It doesn't matter. I mean, I'm retired from teaching on a regular basis.
Yeah.
But I just taught a course last semester. I'm still active in teaching.
Yeah.
And I teach sometimes in other universities. And I certainly very busy professionally. I'm not retired and in any shape or form.
Yeah, great. Cool. Well, before we get into your career and your some of the research topics, could you tell me a little bit about growing up? You said you immigrated 50 years ago. Where did you grow up? Or where were you from originally?
So I'm originally from Antwerp, Belgium.
Oh.
And my mother was born there. My parents grew up there, and I was born there. And I stayed there until age 19. Then I immigrated to Israel, and I lived in Israel for 5 years. Then I came here to get a PhD with the intention of going back to Israel. So a lot of people think that I'm Israeli, and I am, but I'm mostly Belgian in terms of what marked me growing up.
Oh, okay. What marked you growing up? But that's an interesting way of putting it. What is it about? What does that mean in your life, being marked by Belgium?
Well, first of all, the thing that had the most impact on my life is the fact that my parents survived the Holocaust. My family is Jewish, I'm Jewish.
Mm.
And my two grandmothers were gassed in Auschwitz. They were shipped from Belgium to, they were born in Poland. They immigrated to Belgium um, at the beginning of the 20th century. And then in 1942, they were put on a train to Auschwitz and gassed. And
Mm.
from an early age, I learned about that. My mother told me, oh, they just went into showers and they thought they were going to get a shower and then they were killed with gas. I think I was maybe at the most 4 years old when I found out.
Mm.
So this really marked me. The whole experience of my parents having barely survived, my father having um, jumped. That was one of my favorite stories. I would ask, Papi, tell me the story of how you jumped off the train that was going to take you to Poland and kill you.
He was on a train going to a
On a
death camp.
train, he was in France. My parents were hiding in France during the war, and he
Oh, dear
barely
God.
escaped. He said, "I almost became a piece of soap." He would say.
Oh my gosh. How old was he?
When he jumped, he was approximately 30 years old.
Was he with any other family members when he jumped on the
No, he
train?
was a prisoner, and he jumped with another prisoner whose identity I never found out. They didn't keep in touch.
Oh my gosh. Was that planned? Was that a planned escape? Did they have like or did they just see an opportunity?
No, that's what I always admired about my father, that even though he was not athletic, but the train was stationed at the last station in France before the train was going to get into Switzerland.
Oh gosh.
And at that point, he decided this is my last chance to get off.
Oh
But
dear God.
luckily, it was one of the first trains that took Jews to concentration camps from France, and they did not lock it from the outside because
Oh my gosh, you're kidding
at a
me.
later stage they would be impossible to jump.
I bet
But he
they
was, he
were
was
they
just
do you think they were keeping good records of the number of prisoners that got on the train and then the number that got off?
probably the Germans were very efficient. This was organized by the Germans.
Yeah. So they know they've got a market design problem. They know that they've got to start changing some of their practices because they're losing prisoners like
Right.
escapes. Oh my gosh. I did not know that, Shoshana, about you. How did your father and your mother meet?
So my parents got married in the middle of the war in 1942 in Antwerp, Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
And their honeymoon was to go on an escape with my father's family. And the plan was for them to get to Switzerland, which was neutral.
Mm.
So they could, if they had a way to get to Switzerland, they could survive the war.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the plan. And my father got caught by the French police because he wasn't listening to the instructions. They had hired somebody called un passeur, somebody whose job was to help people, go from one part of the train to the other part of the train to avoid control. And he just wasn't there, and so they caught him, and then he was in a prison camp, first in France in the Pyrenees, a place called Gurs, which I think is in Basque country, but I'm not 100% sure.
Mm-hmm.
And anyways, he was there for a little while until they decided to ship the Jews to Poland, probably Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, my mother was with a friend in Nice, France, in the south of France, and waited for my father. And there was this additional stories that, it would take the whole session if I told you all the stories. But my parents had a very interesting life, and they barely escaped and survived.
Mm. So you grew up in Belgium because that's where they immigrated after their escape. They were originally from Germany? No.
No. My mother was born in Belgium.
Belgium.
Her
Okay.
parents, her parents, I never met any of my grandparents. Her parents immigrated from Poland. All my grandparents were from the same part of Poland around Krakow and Tarnów. And so genetically, I'm 100% Polish Ashkenazi Jew.
Mm,
But my mother's parents immigrated before World War I, so she was born there.
yeah.
And in Belgium, and my father and his family immigrated in 1925, and so he grew up first in Poland and then he came to Belgium. But they met in Belgium, they got married in Belgium, and then they escaped with the intention of getting to Switzerland, but they never made it to Switzerland, and they survived in Nice, or at the border with Italy.
Mm. Um, I am just didn't know any of that. That's so what was it like? What was it like as a kid growing up in Belgium? What year would that have been, going from like 0 to 10?
So I was born in the shadow of the Holocaust. I was born in 1948. My parents returned from hiding in 45. They first lost a child, and that was also a tragedy. So my mother returned pregnant, advanced pregnancy, and the child was born, and then they lost the child, and I was born in the shadow of a double tragedy. First, they lost their parents and their brothers, and then they lost a child, and finally I was born, but they were really worn out, and they were older. My father was 36, my mother was 33, and they had gone through so much, and they didn't have much patience for a little child. And I was the only child there. So.
They didn't have much patience for an only. What do you mean?
Yeah, they were worn out. They had gone through so much. They were both facing various types of depression, and but they were very close to their family. There was an extended family there, so these relatives had suffered less because they got to Switzerland. So they came back, and they were kind of cheerful, and they also lost a lot. I mean, on my father's side, my grandmother was one of 11 kids, and the 7 who stayed in Poland were all killed. And my grandmother was killed from Belgium, but her 3 brothers survived in Switzerland. Then they came back. So my great uncles were a big part of my childhood, and it wasn't all bad.
Wow.
But it was challenging for a little girl to have to go through all this. And also what happened is that most Jewish kids in Antwerp had the same story. There's not a single Jewish child who grew up in Antwerp during that period who didn't have major losses in their family. And some of them had the worst. I thought I was relatively lucky because my parents wouldn't scream at night from having nightmares and stuff.
They would. They still had. It was probably like.
I had a very good friend whose mother had been in Auschwitz and escaped, somehow survived, and she screamed every night.
Oh, goodness. So I'm sure, I mean, it's obvious, but we would call it now post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm sure it was just rampant. Yeah. Did they move with you to Israel? Did you say that? I missed that part.
No, not at all.
You went by yourself.
I went by myself. It was after the 6-Day War, when Israel had a war with many Arab countries, and so I was very attached to Israel already as an adolescent. Being part of a Zionist youth group was a big part of my childhood.
Yeah. So I bet you, I can only imagine. I mean, what's it like as a young person living in the shadow of the Holocaust with like your immediate family having been murdered, and they were murdered as a part of a collective murdering campaign, to go to a place like Israel where that was probably a common story at the time everywhere? What was that like as a young person for you?
So, um, you know, growing up in Antwerp, my father was somewhat of a Zionist. He was attached to Israel. He had grown up in Poland, and over there it was very common. Jews were persecuted in Poland as well before the war. And he, there was a numerous clauses that, by the way, affected Jacob Mincer as well.
Really?
So I felt very close to Jacob Mincer later on in my life because he really reminded me of my father.
Mm.
He had a similar handwriting. My father left Poland in 1925, and he was 12 years old. Jacob Mincer left Poland when he was 17 years old. It's not so different. So they really had their elementary school education in Poland, in Polish school with Polish language. My father was perfectly fluent in Polish, but I never learned the language because my mother didn't know a word of Polish. She's Belgian,
Yeah. Yeah. Was he your father's age? Was Jacob Mincer your father's age?
Not close enough. My father was born in 1912 and Jacob Mincer was born 10 years later.
I see.
1922. So it's
Okay.
the same generation.
So what are you doing in Israel for those 5 years? You're in college?
Yeah, that's what I had started college in Brussels at the Free University of Brussels, ULB in French. And then I switched to Hebrew University, and that had actually a big impact on my career. I had no idea. I was majoring in economics in Brussels, and then I continued to major in economics at Hebrew University. And I just went because I'm a Zionist. I'm tired of Europe. I don't want, I want to live in Israel, and I had a lot of friends who did the same thing. And so I didn't think this is going to affect my career as an economist, but actually it did. And I'll be happy to talk about that.
Well, so you were majoring in economics back in Antwerp. What drew you to economics back there before we get into Hebrew?
Okay, so it was by elimination because actually, I had an excellent high school education, and in Antwerp, in Dutch, a place called Koninklijk Lyceum voor Meisjes, which means Royal High School for Girls, and it was public school, and I loved the humanities. They didn't give us a lot of choices. It was either Latin math, Latin science, or Latin Greek. So I wasn't interested at that time in science or math. And so I took Latin Greek, and I studied a lot of languages and history, and, I was going in that direction. And I loved theater and French literature, and I was not on the road to become an economist. But then I decided around age 15, I'm going to live in Israel. I'm not going to live here. And I heard that they didn't need a lot of French teachers in Israel, that they were already saturated with high school French teachers. So I thought to myself, what am I going to do? I can't just be in literature and stuff like that. So I decided on a social science. I wasn't ready to become a biologist or a chemist or any of that. I didn't have the training by the time I was finishing high school. So by elimination, I got to economics. And that's.
Do you remember, were there any professors at Antwerp that, people would know about? They were active researchers or economists that we would know about, or that I would have heard of?
At the time, there was barely a university in Antwerp. I went to university in Brussels.
Brussels. Okay.
Which is a short train ride. And no, there were not too many famous economists at this university.
Okay.
The top university in Belgium until now is the Catholic University in Leuven.
Okay. So then you go to Hebrew and you take your first economics class. What are you, a freshman, or do you transfer credits, or what happens?
Well, in the first year in Brussels, they didn't even teach us economics. We learned math and statistics and all kinds of things. So I had to take introductory economics. And from the point of view of my later career, it was really a blessing that the Six-Day War broke out, and I switched from studying in Belgium to studying in Israel because there were opportunities to do so as a foreign student. And I got fantastic teachers. My first year, my principal teacher was Yoram Ben Porat. You probably have heard of him since, well, he's still considered a well-known labor and household economist. He wrote important. He was in the tradition of Becker Mincer economics.
Oh.
But he was trained at Harvard.
Oh, okay.
And
Okay.
yeah, Ben Porat is a well-known. He was more like a theorist, and so he was an excellent teacher. And then the whole department of economics at Hebrew University had been built by Don Patenkin, was one of the top students of Milton Friedman. He was from Chicago. He had grown up in Chicago, and then he went to University of Chicago. And because he was already well known and he had taught at Chicago part of the time, so he built the Department of Economics at Hebrew U on the basis of Chicago.
Oh, interesting.
And it was the whole world in those days, I don't know if there were many such departments. Maybe
so it was like a clone. It was like a clone of Chicago. It was because you even said this other person was a labor economist in the Becker Mincer. Was he from Columbia?
No. Yoram Ben Porat, I'm pretty sure, got his degree at Harvard.
Oh, at Harvard. Oh, okay.
But he did become close to Becker and Mincer intellectually, and he might have spent some time in New York at Columbia. I'm not sure.
Was Milton Friedman did you ever see him at Hebrew, like as a visitor or anything like that?
No, Milton Friedman was not much of a Zionist. He was not, I don't know if he even had visited Israel by that point. At a later point, when Israel and many other countries struggled with inflation,
so, he would go over there and help them.
So did the United States in the 1970s and 80s. Then he came to Israel to give advice.
I see. What about Becker? Was Becker over there when you were there?
That's a really good question. I don't know exactly how attached Becker was to Israel. He was Jewish also. He definitely had a tendency to take Israeli students. So during his time at Columbia, quite a few, proportionately, a high percentage of his PhD students were Israeli.
I see.
And I don't know if it was more so than at Columbia in general. I haven't looked that up. But I have learned in the last decades that I've been studying the history of Becker and Mincer and their as economists at Columbia, and then Becker at Chicago. In terms of attachment to Israel, Jacob Mincer was a big Zionist. He was very attached to Israel. His grandparents, one set of grandparents of Jacob, survived the war, and I think in the Far East of Russia, of the Soviet Union, and then they got to Israel, and he got to visit his grandparents at some point in the 1950s, I think. He got to see his grandparents. So his whole family had been killed in the Holocaust. His parents, his two sisters, and probably, many more relatives. But he still had his grandparents who survived in Israel. And I don't know if he had become a Zionist in Poland before the war. It's very likely because he knew Hebrew. He had studied Hebrew. He had studied some Hebrew in Poland. And, you know, it was very common for Jewish people in Poland before World War II to be attached to Israel. And if there had been a way to immigrate to Israel in those years, in the 1930s, probably hundreds of thousands of Jews would have left Poland to go to Israel, but there was no way to do so. So he ended up being in labor camps and barely surviving the war. And he has actually written about his experience in the Holocaust. And he was very attached to Israel, Jacob Mincer. So he took a special link, and he took a special approach to Israeli students.
He took a special approach. He just was more.
He took them under his wings, like he had a very close connection, for example, with Reuven Gronau, who I think you know pretty well in terms of his work, because he's also an econometrician, and he was a student of both Becker and Mincer, and he was very close to Mincer. He continued to stick until Flora Mincer, the widow of Jacob, died and became pretty incapacitated towards the end of her life. She had Alzheimer. Reuven Gronau would stay with her even after Jacob died.
Oh, wow. So can you tell me what your first memory is of really being impressed or even amazed by economics?
Okay, very good question. First of all, after I arrived in Jerusalem, it became clear to me, I had no idea, you know, being a first-year student in Brussels, I had no idea that the Hebrew University in Jerusalem was such a special place for economics.
Yeah.
But once I arrived there, it became obvious to me, and students would say, oh, you know, the textbook was by Don Patenkin. It had been translated to Hebrew. So I didn't know Hebrew very well. I had to learn Hebrew just to read Introduction to Economics by Don Patenkin. That was the textbook. Everything was built around it. And it became clear to me that I'm very lucky to have landed in this, you know, great place. And many of the students who graduated, the best students went on for PhDs at Chicago, Columbia, and at Harvard. You know, that was like, I was blown away by this.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. And plus, I mean, there were terrific teachers. They were excellent. One of the outstanding teachers was Eitan Shishinsky, who was a price theory guy. And there were a few more, and I took the masters as well. But the teacher I liked the most during my 5 years at Jerusalem was Simon Kuznets, who came to visit Hebrew University to give his last class. He was in his 80s already. He had retired from Harvard, and he gave us a class on population and economic growth. It was, you know, a great class, and I felt very privileged to be able to take that class.
Wow. Yeah. So when did you decide you wanted to be an economist?
I had already by that point, first of all, I had majored in economics. I became an economist, obviously, but then I decided to continue my graduate students' studies. And I double majored in economics and sociology at Hebrew University. You had to double major. It was a requirement. And since I was very drawn to sociology already as a teenager, I took those two. And then for the master's, I really hesitated. Should I continue in economics or in sociology? And I decided economics, but I kept a real interest in sociology, especially social anthropology.
Yeah. I see. Did you think about doing a PhD in sociology then? Or even anthropology?
I even took some classes in master's classes in sociology while I was doing the master in economics. I had some kind of a minor in sociology.
But you didn't think about applying to graduate doctoral program for sociology?
No. By the time I was in my second year of the master's in Jerusalem, I was clearly going to go on in economics.
I see. Okay. So where'd you apply?
So then it's like another twist that I really liked Israel. I had, wanted to live there my whole childhood. I mean, starting at age 12, maybe.
Yeah.
And I didn't intend to come to the United States, but at the time I was married to my first husband, who was also an immigrant. And he didn't want to serve in the Israeli army. And after 5 years in Israel, he would have had to serve. And he said, let's go to America. So it was his idea.
So you would have stayed, if you had stayed in Israel and gotten your doctorate, would it have been at Hebrew? Probably. I don't know a lot about the PhD programs in Israel.
Yeah, I guess I would have continued. At the time, I was very committed to living in Jerusalem. I would have probably continued at Hebrew University. Yeah.
Okay. So you think, okay, so now we're going to go to America. So now so keep going. Sorry.
Right. So then we applied. He was in political science and international relations, me in economics. We applied to maybe 7 universities, including Columbia and Chicago. And we both got accepted at both. And I think at Columbia, I had some more financial help than I was getting at Chicago. I got some at Chicago, but not much. But I really wanted to go to Chicago.
You did. That was because of your experiences.
That's what we did.
That was because of your experiences at Hebrew with some of these professors, or was it?
Right then, this is now the year 1972. And by then, Becker had left Columbia in 1969. So
you were thinking about Becker. You were kind of wanting to go where Becker was?
Not really. I was not that into Becker at the time, but in part because Becker had left, and there had been in 1968, Becker left in part because of the student revolution in the United States, and Columbia was one of the prominent departments of economics where students tried to overtake the not just economics, but
the whole university. I didn't know that Becker's reasoning for leaving Columbia was partly
one of the reasons.
Wow.
He was very upset that the university had taken the side of students, and they were, on they're still very left-wing, Columbia. They were that way in 1968 as well. And Jacob and Gary were very upset about that.
Wow.
Winter also considered leaving New York for that reason, and he was offered a job at Chicago.
He decided to stay.
He decided to stay mostly because his wife, Flora Mincer, was a prominent oncologist, a radiologist, and she was a medical doctor.
I see.
And she didn't want to move.
Wow. I have never heard that factoid. I just kind of thought, oh yeah, I just wanted to go back home to Chicago, but that's not really what it was. It wasn't
more home. He had grown up first in Pennsylvania and then in Brooklyn.
Right.
And actually,
I thought he grew up in Indiana. He grew up in Pennsylvania.
He was born and raised in Pennsylvania. I forgot the name of the town. Small town, Allentown, maybe.
Okay. I actually thought it was Gary, Indiana, but that's probably because his name is Gary.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm learning lots of new things. All right. So he goes back. So you get to Chicago in 1972? Wait, so you apply to a few places. You apply to a few places? Did you apply to a few schools?
And I was accepted at Columbia in Chicago, and I chose Chicago because by then it was clearly a better department. They had And I had studied at Jerusalem with Don Potenkin, who was still constantly going to Chicago. And there were Chicago people visiting, mostly people probably macro and monetary economics, but I was not particularly interested. I don't even remember their names.
Yeah.
I'm sure Potenkin was at the time a very well-known economist.
Chicago was internationally renowned as a phenomenal economics department in 1972, the way they are right now, or even more so, or less so, or
many people think that was like the golden age because you had an amazing faculty there at the time.
So
Milton Friedman was still in residence. When I took Milton Friedman's class in the first quarter at Chicago in the fall of 72, it was the last time he taught price theory.
Because how old was he?
A massive heart attack.
He had a massive heart attack? Oh, I didn't know
he
that.
Was born, I think he was born in 1911, so he was only 61 years old.
Goodness. Oh, wow. He lived for a while longer, though. He passed away in the 80s.
Much longer, yeah, much longer. But he continued to be at Chicago for a while.
Yeah.
But he wasn't teaching this huge class. We had there were many undergraduates taking the class. It was a huge class.
So he was teaching price theory. And you took it from him. You didn't take Becker's famous price theory class.
I also took Becker's. It was in the first quarter. You could take either Milton Friedman when I started in the fall of 72. You could take either Milton Friedman or Don McCluskey, who became Deirdre McCluskey.
Oh, wow.
So McCluskey was taking the students who had to catch up because, I had gotten fantastic scores on my GRE in economics because I had been trained for 5 years at a Chicago.
Oh, yeah, right.
It was like, so I was really prepared for Chicago.
But then McCloskey would take, because Chicago had a reputation of taking a larger variance of incoming students, and then they would sort of see who would make it.
Exactly. So I was also lucky in that respect because in part because I had been an immigrant to Israel, my grades were not so fantastic in the beginning.
Right.
And so I was still able to get to Chicago because they would take a lot of students. And Greg Lewis was in charge of admissions.
Oh, wow. Really?
And he really liked Israeli students. We were 3 people from Jerusalem who in the entering class.
Wow.
At Chicago.
So who was in your class?
There were no other 3 students from any other university.
Oh, wow.
There were 2 from Princeton.
Who were some of the classmates that were sort of sorted into academia that people might have known of that were in your cohort?
Sandy Grossman was in my class with Milton Friedman. He was at the time, he was just an undergraduate. He was probably just 19, but because he was doing the BA and the PhD together.
Oh, they did. They had a BA PhD.
They had that. Yeah, there were a few of these really brilliant young guys.
Yeah.
Who were doing both BA and PhD.
Right. So he was in there. Anybody else? Were you the only female in your cohort?
Not the only, but one of the only. Approximately 70 students started that year, and there were approximately 5 or 6 women.
5 or 6 women. Okay. How many people?
And many of them didn't finish.
They don't finish, right? That was the Chicago production function, was take a large group and then see who makes it to the second stage, like a tournament. Right.
So of the women who started with me, I think only 2 of us finished.
Who was the other female?
Me and Indira. So it was some Indian ladies who never became very famous, and she also studied with Becker.
Oh, okay. So
Kulkarni, I think her last name was Kulkarni.
Okay. So how many years were you there? From 72 to
I was in residence for 4 years,
Oh,
which
4 years.
included the whole, after one quarter, I did well, and I started getting a scholarship. But because I was a foreign student, I didn't qualify for certain scholarships.
Mm.
And my scholarship was basically an opportunity to be a research assistant for T.W. Schultz,
Oh, really?
who was a fantastic man.
Oh, wow.
I was very lucky. And then after for my third and fourth year, I qualified for the Sloan Scholarship. Becker
Oh,
chose me as one of the recipients of a Sloan Scholarship that he could give to his students.
yeah. And so you got that.
I got that.
That's
I don't
great.
know who else got it, but I was one of the ones, maybe
Okay.
2 or 3 who got that.
Okay. So tell me about those 4 years. Are you very rapidly sort of realizing, yeah, I want to work? Like, what is it like at Chicago? You are going to say, knock, 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 Dr. Becker, will you be my advisor? Or is it that you're just working and is it's just kind of organic who becomes your advisor? Can you describe it to somebody that's never been there?
So first of all, it was like a wonderland for economists. I mean, it was just amazing. Every professor was brilliant. And, like my whole first year, I had Stanley Fisher from macroeconomics. I had Bob Barrow for the second segment of macroeconomics.
Wow.
Then in winter and spring, it was Gary Becker teaching two quarters of his famous price theory class, and we were using a textbook that he wrote and that Michael Grossman and Bob Michael had edited. That by the time I was in the middle of my first quarter in the fall, I had changed direction, because in Israel I started writing a dissertation, a master thesis about economics of education.
Mm.
And I was taking a class by Mary Jane Bauman in the education department at Chicago.
Mm.
And it didn't interest me at all. She was not interesting to me. And I decided not to continue in education after a few weeks.
Mm.
And by then I had, heard about Gary Becker. I had not yet taken any of his classes, but by the time I took his first class in the winter of 73, that was it. I said, I want to have Gary Becker as my advisor.
What about Dr. Becker was so, what was it about him that did that other faculty didn't have quite that, because you're around all these brilliant people. So what is it about Dr. Becker that's impacting you so much?
So he had a charismatic personality.
Mm.
And he, at that time, he was about 42 years old. Okay. Young, he was energetic, and he chose to teach the class. Remember, there's like more than 70 students in that class. Everybody is going to try to pass the core exam at the end of the spring. Okay, so you have this huge class, and he wanted us to be in an auditorium where he could make eye contact with every student, so we would cross the midway to the law school and sit there, and he could see everybody. And he would ask you direct questions. You already heard some of that from Michael. Bob Michael was telling you about how, how intimidating it was. But because I had already gone through so much with my parents and moving to Israel and moving to Chicago, I was not intimidated. And I would often respond when he asked questions. And so, he liked to interact with me, and I had fun with that. And I was really enchanted that this, brilliant teacher, and he likes me, and I thought he liked me.
Yeah. So was he actively at that time? This was like mid 70s. So he's working on family topics.
Yes, yes. Actually, that's the same year that the theory of marriage came out,
Mm.
and we had to study that article.
Is that
And
solo
I
authored?
went,
Is that co-authored with, is it a part one and a part two that's co-authored with someone? Am I thinking of something different?
no, no. The theory of marriage is solely authored by Becker. Both parts. Part one is published in 73.
Yeah.
Part two is published
It
in
is a part one, part
74.
two.
They're
Okay.
both in the JPE, and Becker is the sole author.
Mm.
And Mincer never really went that way. First of all, they never co-authored anything,
Yeah.
which is one of the reasons that people are forgetting Mincer. It's a tragedy. I'm very upset about it. And I was so happy with Bob Michael's interview with you, because through the interview you kept asking Becker, and he kept at a number
Kept
of
saying
times,
about Mincer.
a couple
Yeah.
of times, he said, this is not just Becker, it's Mincer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So by the time Becker moves to Chicago, Mincer is getting less attention, and in part, Becker writes these articles on marriage, which Mincer was not involved in, and he never got that far into that direction.
Yeah. 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 So he's right. Yeah, I think I was thinking of, I have such a horrible memory. I'm thinking of Elizabeth.
Oh, Landis.
Yes, Elizabeth Landis has a co-authored paper on the family divorce. Maybe is it three
Yeah,
people?
that's
like
1977. That's Becker, Michael, and
oh, that's
Becker,
Bob.
Landis, Michael.
Oh, that's Bob.
1977.
Glad
Now,
I did that on his
Lisa
interview.
Landis completed her PhD at Columbia.
Right.
Okay, so from the point of view of the history of economics of the household, and what for a while was called the new home economics, and I prefer the term modern household economics, but what that was started at Columbia by Mincer and Becker. I'm pretty it's very hard to
see
exactly
right. You see the economics of the family / modern labor, or that as kind of being at Columbia. And continuing at Chicago.
Modern labor, I would say, and I think Jim Heckman supports that. I just recently had a conversation with him in London. I would say the fathers, and I think this is in writing, if you really want to see it, I can find it. It's not by Heckman, but by Mincer himself. The fathers of modern labor economics are, first of all, Greg Lewis, and then Becker and Mincer.
Oh.
Okay, that's the fathers of modern labor economics. Then you go to household economics. Now that includes human capital, in my opinion. Even though Greg Lewis never did that much on human capital, but both Mincer and Becker did a lot on human capital. Jacob Mincer's thesis is on human capital, economics of human capital. Okay, so now you have another type of work that develops at Columbia in the 1960s, and that's what I now call, and many others call, household economics, and it can be called modern household economics because it's really different from home economics and whatever was done in Chicago and other places by home economists like Margaret Reed. Okay, right. So you have the household becoming the key agent in economic models that are connected to labor economics. And in my opinion, the number one force there is Jacob Mincer. But since Jacob Mincer doesn't publish theoretical pieces in top journals about it, but he just publishes 2 articles in volumes of that didn't have that much impact. Okay, but they precede Becker's theory of allocation of time.
Yeah.
And every single theme that Becker touches upon in the 65 article on theory of allocation of time is already covered by Jacob Mincer in his 1963 article on opportunity cost. So, but he doesn't have any, production function and
Right.
the maximization, which today is not really thought of as so crucial that you should have a, maximization model. So, Mincer would go directly to the econometrics. He had the idea of looking at labor force participation of women and fertility and consumption and transportation. All those themes are already in Mincer's 1963 article on opportunity costs. And people forget that because all they know is Becker. And Becker did a lot to make people forget Mincer. I don't know how purposefully he did it. It might have been just his habit of aggrandizing himself with respect to everybody.
Or did they ever have a falling out?
No, they loved each other.
Oh, they did.
Mincer, having been a Holocaust survivor, starting his education after he had been in DP camps, survived, somehow made it. Some nice officer from the US Army took a liking to this young man who knew English and translated for him and arranged for him to get a scholarship at Emory University in Atlanta.
Mincer went to Emory?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Huh.
At age 26, 27, he was, he had survived the Holocaust. The Holocaust started when he had moved to Czechoslovakia, and the Germans invaded in 1938. He was 17 years old.
So you devoted your whole career, to building up the economics of the family, in a lot of ways, both through your own scholarship, but also as an editor. And so I'm curious about the origins of your journal, Review of Economics of the Household. Can you tell me why that journal got started? Why wasn't Journal of Labor Economics or Journal of Human Resources? Why wasn't that enough? What was missing in academia?
Very good question. I'm very happy to respond to that. So, after I graduated and wrote my dissertation under Gary Becker with participation, Jim Heckman served on my committee. Ed Lazier served on my committee.
Oh, wow.
I had access to Greg Lewis, and I took his labor economics classes, which influenced my analytical skills. I had a fantastic education, and I'm writing an innovative thesis on polygamy, which was a subject covered by Becker in his article in the JPE. T.W. Schultz, who gets the Nobel Prize first of all these professors I took, it was in 1979. I was already finished. I got my degree in 1978. But, T.W. Schultz was a big light. He was a luminary. Yeah, Nobel Prize. Second Nobel Prize from Chicago after Milton Friedman, and he had encouraged me to do this dissertation. He had found the data for me.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I think when I left Chicago, I thought I was like a star. I was going to be a star, and it was not at all like that. I had a terrible time finding any job. For all kinds of reasons, but I won't delve into that. But I even though I spent a year at Stanford at the Center for Advanced Study early on in my career, 1980 to 81, I got 2 top publications in 84 and 88 in the JPE and the Economic Journal. I felt very, very confident that I'm going to make it as a well-known or well-established economist in a good university with PhD students. That I took that for granted.
Right.
It didn't happen. Didn't happen, and I kept thinking, what is missing? I got the top professors. I got publications in top journals. Oh, maybe I'll write a book. So I write The Economics of Marriage as a book. And, so far it has almost 500 citations. That's not too bad, but, that's over a long period of time, because I published it in 93. So I thought, a book, that's going to make a difference. Now I'm going to get an offer somewhere in a, good university with PhD students.
Yeah.
Nothing happens. Okay. So then
what were you thinking would be a likely outcome, just so that I can kind of reference it from what you thought might happen to what did happen? What kind of things were you thinking this is a natural trajectory and that it would look like?
I don't know exactly, like there's all kinds of other factors involved, but it's been frustrating for me my whole career that I have not been associated with a university that has a PhD in economics.
Right.
That's a big must. If you want to have an impact, you must have PhD students going to work under you.
Right.
So
right.
that's been a big factor, and that not more concrete than that. And all the people who studied with me, who were not necessarily getting, I was among the top students in terms of my grades at Chicago. Like they graded you out of these 70 people that everybody practically took the core exam, and then they would come up with who are the top 10 students. I was among them.
Yeah.
So, and the other labor economists, some of them were there too, but some were not.
Yeah.
But they landed PhD, in PhD granting institutions.
Yeah.
I started scratching my head. What happened? How come? I've done all the things you're supposed to do, and I still refuse to say, oh, I was discriminated against because I'm a woman. I mean, it's possible. It's very possible. It's hard to prove, and I'm not going to use that as an excuse. Okay, so here I am. By the 90s, my book comes out in 93. And, by then I've tried everything that you're supposed to do to land a job in a top university and have a good reputation. Okay, being considered what they call a good economist. That's what they would say at Chicago.
Oh, really?
Economist.
He's a good economist.
That's the greatest compliment you could get. Okay, so nobody's saying that about me. Yeah. And I'm frustrated. And so I started studying what happens when Becker moved from Columbia to Chicago. Because look, all these people who studied at Columbia, they did so well. Bill Landis gets to the law school at Chicago. Bob Michael, first he's at Stanford, then he comes to Chicago. Michael Grossman is directing the health economics at NBR from the time he graduates, practically.
Right.
And the list is long. There's Saul Palachek and Reuven Gronau and Isaac Ehrlich, and you have a whole list of people who did great in their career as economists.
Right.
And then it's not just me at Chicago who's going nowhere. There's Michael Keeley. You never heard of him. He was a top student. He's my age, but he started 2 years earlier because he didn't go get a master's at Hebrew University. Anyway, he went directly from BA to PhD. So he also studied with Gary Becker. He did a very nice dissertation on age at marriage. That's like includes the first model of search in the marriage market.
Wow.
10 years before Mortensen, who eventually got the Nobel Prize for search theory.
Yeah.
Michael Keeley writes a very similar model that's published in Economic Inquiry. And nobody talks about Michael Keeley. Michael Keeley doesn't get the top position. He gets to Stanford Research Institute, which is, a nice, respectable research institute at the time, but this is nothing mind-blowing like the students of Jim Heckman, who came out a year after us, so about the same time, and they land. McCurdy goes to Stanford, and John About goes to Princeton. Okay, so I'm pretty sure it's Princeton. So, these are Jim Heckman students who are riding the wave of the new labor econometrics.
Right.
The new panel data.
Right.
The new this, the new that. They get top positions, top appointments. And the Becker students who, not just Becker, but, students of other professors in labor economics, nobody's doing great. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, how come it was so different at Columbia? That became a pressing question to me. And because I was connected personally to Jacob Mincer, he came for a quarter at Chicago, I think in 75, and I took his class, which was all about Mincer equations. It was not about household economics, but still, I got exposed to him. I got to talk to him. Then Mincer, at two different points, invited me to give a talk at Columbia in the labor workshop. So I'm talking to Mincer. I'm talking to other people. I become friendly with Andrea Beller early on, who was a student at Columbia, but she only had Becker for 1 year. Then he left for Chicago, but she knows everybody. And I get to meet a bunch of other people who got their PhD there, including women who'll be very friendly to me. So I'm starting to figure out, this is not about me. This is about Becker first being buddy with Jacob Mincer and running the labor workshop with him, and then moving to Chicago and entering a different orbit. This is now Chicago is Milton Friedman, George Stigler. These become the important people in Becker's life.
Wow, that's interesting. This is interesting on a lot of levels, but this was really personal for you. This was also you trying to make sense of your career.
Right.
Yeah. How has that, so how do you, I guess, how does all that make you feel?
It makes me feel like now that 20 years, well, we're talking now, this 93, I published my book. The journal is born around 2001. So it's almost a decade. The first issue comes out in 2003. So, it is thanks to all this thinking I'm doing about Becker, Mincer, Chicago, Columbia, and the new home economics has been lost. Where is it? In 1990, in 2000, where is the new home economics? It disappeared. When I organized a conference for Jacob Mincer's 80th birthday at Columbia in 2002, 20 years ago, Jim Heckman asked me to organize that conference. How come he didn't ask a Columbia professor to do that? Jim Heckman doesn't even know anybody teaching, or doesn't know very well anyone teaching at Columbia at that point. He calls me or contacts me at San Diego State University and asks me, would you like to organize that? And why did he get to me? Because I had already circulated at that point a manuscript about the new home economics at Columbia and Chicago, which got published in Feminist Economics. And that's where I first wrote, I wrote a lot of stuff, but I wrote, among other things, Jacob Mincer deserves more credit. By then, Becker had received his Nobel Prize and Jacob did not get it. And people like Heckman and me who know the history think it's a great injustice. Because even though Becker had many ideas, the idea of economics of the family that became the topic of his treatise is probably the number one idea. And it comes from Mincer. It starts with Mincer. So it's a terrible justice to that Becker. Nobody talks about Mincer.
It also sounds like Dr. Heckman has been a very supportive person in your career. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, but not all the time. And he did not help me get a job.
Sure. Okay. Okay. But he's continuing to sort of like support you after that. Is that right? Asking you to organize things.
He continues to be supportive, and I'm very grateful for that. I'm also very grateful to Gary Becker for whatever he gave me. He gave me a lot.
Right.
Okay?
Right. Right.
It didn't end with a job, but it's, it gave me a lot.
Yeah.
And another thing he did not give me, which I'm still a little upset about, but much less now, is that from the time I left Chicago in 76, and I still didn't have my PhD, but I had presented my work on the economics of polygamy in the workshop, in Becker's workshop, at least once, maybe twice. From that point on, I wrote many other articles, including my economic journal article, which has nothing to do with polygamy, or very little. Becker never invited me to present a paper in his workshop. He ran his workshop until he died. 2014. All these years, I tried many times until I gave up. I sent him many of my papers. I said, I think this is a very good paper. Maybe you would like to invite me to present it. He invited many of his former students to give papers.
How did that feel?
Never invited me. So that's another,
how did that make you feel?
That hurt me. But at the same time, he was very nice.
Yeah.
And in the case of Heckman, I was able to recently invite him to be the keynote speaker at the SEHO meetings, the Society of Economics of the Household meetings in London.
Yeah.
But that's because the lecture was called Jacob Mincer Lecture, because I know how Jim
feels
Heckman
about Mincer,
about Jacob Mincer being forgotten. And the fact that he got this up, he was thrilled that he had this opportunity to tell a crowd of young people in household economics how important Jacob Mincer was. And he spent almost the whole lecture praising Jacob Mincer.
This has been such a meaningful conversation. I really appreciate it, Shoshana. I've just have grown over the years to really have a lot of affection and look up to you a lot. I want to end with one question. This isn't meant to ask you what your favorite paper in economics is. I asked something like that to Susan Athey, and she said, you're not supposed to talk in terms of superlatives. So I'm going to say it differently. What's a paper in economics that you have found to sort of reside in your memory and your thought a lot? You think about it regularly. Maybe it even surprises you that you've thought about that, you continue to think about it, that it's apparently meant a lot to you.
Wow. I find that difficult to answer. I mean, because I had such fantastic teachers, and I tend to think that when somebody presents material in a classroom or a seminar, it has more impact than when it is in written form.
Yeah.
I can't really think of one article. Like I've been very influenced by Becker and Greg Lewis, and I would say those are Milton Friedman. Those are the teachers who really influenced me. I was very impressed by some of the presentations I heard in the law and economics workshop at Chicago. I mean, Ronald Coase was there. I mean, you had such brilliant people there. And the nostalgia that I carry is the nostalgia for Chicago in the 1970s. That's what I carry. Oh, I forgot Ed Lazier. I was so lucky to have Ed Lazier in my career early on. We are, he died unfortunately recently, but we are contemporaries. We're both born in 1948. And he arrived in a year after I did, and he was already an assistant professor with a PhD from Harvard, studied with Gridlicus. And I was just doing my master's, my PhD, I mean. But we hit it off, and he was wonderful. He was so supportive until the very end, always writing me nice emails. I was very lucky to have people like that. So that's why I kept wondering, what's going on with Becker? Why isn't he more supportive? I mean, here are these other people that they're pretty intelligent, they're pretty successful. Heckman and Lazier and T.W. Schultz and later Clive Granger and Jack Hirschleifer I became friendly with in California. What's wrong? Nothing is wrong with me. I don't think anything is
right.
Anyway, that's there's no article I really go back to. I'm more.
It sounds like your it sounds like from what I can gather, is the things that really impacted you were your teachers.
The teachers and the people who I talked to, and they supported me and helped me develop intellectually. And I also want to say thank you to Zach Rolnick, who was working as an editor for Kluwer, and he signed me up for the Review of Economics of the Household in 2001. So I'm very grateful to him. He saw that I have a message to carry about the legacy of the new home economics from Minter and Becker, and he saw that.
Well, thank you so much, Shoshana, for giving me this hour of your time. I really have enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And your questions were very good. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to talk about my high school teachers and some of the questions you asked about Michael and a few other people.
It was wonderful. Well, you have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.